In a quiet collection room, long after the museum has closed, a drawer slides open on felt runners and stops beneath a strip of cold white light. Inside is a narrow skull, no larger than a hand. The teeth are fine and sharp. The snout is delicate. A brown paper tag, old enough to have softened at the edges, carries a name written in ink, Ferret. And beneath it, a stranger word, Libya. That is where the mystery begins. Not in a farmyard, or a child's bedroom, or a medieval rabbit hunt, but in the gap between an animal and the story attached to it. Because the creature we think we know so well, the domestic ferret, sleek, mischievous, familiar, has always arrived in history already half explained. Everyone seemed to know what a ferret was. Very few people could say, with confidence, where it truly came from. For generations, the accepted version sounded simple enough. Ferrets were said to be ancient domesticated hunters, tamed thousands of years ago, perhaps by the Egyptians, perhaps somewhere around the Mediterranean, then carried into Europe and used to drive rabbits from their burrows. It was a neat story. Too neat, as it turned out. The evidence behind it was thin, uneven, and in some places almost folkloric. Ferrets were everywhere in the historical imagination, but at the point of origin, they seemed to dissolve. And that odd word on the tag, Libya, was part of the reason. Ancient writers had left tantalizing references to small hunting animals used against rabbits. Greek and Roman texts describe mustelids bred in captivity, sent into warrens, muzzled so they would flush prey rather than kill it underground. Strabo mentions an animal from Libya used in rabbit hunting. Pliny describes the Balearic Islands so overrun with rabbits that Rome supposedly sent these creatures to help control them. For centuries, readers looked at passages like these and thought the case was closed. Ferret found. Origin solved. But texts can preserve knowledge and distort it at the same time. The old words were slippery. Animal names shifted in translation. The creatures described were sometimes clear, sometimes maddeningly vague. A ferret might be a ferret. It might also be a weasel, a polecat, or simply a small predator pressed into a modern category too quickly. Then there was Egypt, the most seductive claim of all. The story had a certain elegance, a civilization famous for living alongside animals, for mummifying cats, for turning creature and symbol into one. Surely, people said, if anyone had first domesticated the ferret, it would have been them. And yet the archaeological silence is hard to ignore. No clear mummified ferrets. No convincing stream of depictions. No strong chain of material evidence anchoring the myth. For a culture that recorded animals obsessively, that silence matters. It does not absolutely prove the story false. History is rarely that theatrical. But it leaves the grand Egyptian origin looking less like a discovery and more like an inheritance of repetition. The first real fracture in the old story came not from a dramatic ruin or a newly translated scroll, but from biology. Modern genetic work on domestic ferrets and their wild relatives began to clarify something historians had long argued about: what, exactly, the ferret had been made from. At first glance, the answer seemed obvious. The domestic ferret looks like a softened version of a polecat, long body, low gait, carnivore skull, tunnel-built confidence. But resemblance is not proof. Some researchers had pointed to the European polecat. Others suggested the steppe polecat. Some left the question open. Domestication, especially in small predatory mammals, does not always leave clean lines. When scientists compared modern ferrets with wild polecats, the picture sharpened. Again and again, the European polecat emerged as the closest ancestral match. Not necessarily the only contributor in every place and every century, but the strongest line underneath the animal we now call the domestic ferret. Whole genome work strengthened that impression. The European polecat kept appearing as the nearest basal species, the one standing closest to the threshold where wild ancestry turns into domestic history. That mattered. It shifted the ferret story away from exotic legend and back toward European landscapes, woods, margins, burrows, field edges, the ecology of the polecat. It suggested that whatever happened first, ferrets were not some mysterious separate creature arriving fully formed from the ancient imagination. They were polecats, altered by human selection, carried into human work, and then carried across continents. But even that was not the full revelation. In a way, it only deepened the strangeness. Because once genetics identified the likeliest wild ancestor, another problem became impossible to ignore. If the domestic ferret came from the European polecat, where was the birthplace? Where was the clean founding event? Where was the unmistakable archaeological signature one might expect from an animal that became so useful to people? It wasn't there. No single center of domestication stands up cleanly under the evidence. No universally accepted cradle. No decisive ancient cache that says, here, in this village or this court or this hunting estate, the ferret entered human history. Even careful modern references admit how little progress has been made in fixing that center. There is evidence ferrets existed in Europe more than 2,000 years ago. There are literary clues around the Mediterranean. There is a powerful practical logic to their use in rabbit hunting. But the moment of origin itself remains blurred. And this is where the title's promise becomes more interesting than it first sounds. The truth genetics revealed
Ferrets
was not
never
a
what we
tidy
thought
birthplace
in the sense that they were
it
never
was the
simply
collapse of
one
the
tidy
civilization's
story.
clever invention, neatly dated and neatly mapped. Their origin appears messier, quieter, more organic, less like a single act of domestication than a drawn-out relationship between humans and a particular kind of hunter. A polecat with the right temperament. A landscape with rabbit pressure. Repeated capture. Selection for tractability. Familiarity becoming dependency. Utility becoming lineage. In other words, the ferret may have entered history not with a ceremony, but with a job. That job explains a great deal. A cat waits above ground. A dog pursues across distance. A hawk strikes from air. But a ferret can do something almost uncanny. It can vanish into the architecture of another animal's world. Down into the dark. Through narrow turns of packed earth. Into the blind geometry of a rabbit warren. That is not just useful, for ancient and classical societies contending with rabbits as food, pest, and ecological force, it is transformative. Now the word on the museum tag begins to make more sense. Libya may not mark the birthplace of the ferret. It may instead mark the route by which Mediterranean observers first encountered a captive hunting mustelid already in use. The old references were recording circulation, not necessarily origin. A place in the trade world. A place in imperial memory. A place where people saw the animal working. History, once again, had preserved the shadow of movement and mistaken it for the point of creation. And the story grows stranger still when we follow it forward. Modern ferrets are not just descendants of an old domestication. They are the outcome of centuries of transport, isolation, bottlenecks, and inbreeding. Genetic studies show that domestic ferret populations in places like North America and Australia carry strikingly low diversity, likely the legacy of small founder populations and intense breeding. European ferrets, by contrast, often retain more diversity, partly because the wall between domestic ferret and wild polecat has never been perfectly sealed. In Britain, that boundary becomes especially revealing. Whole genome studies of polecats have shown extensive introgression from domestic ferrets into wild populations. Animals that look like pure polecats can still carry ferret ancestry. The farther some populations spread from historic refuges, the more ferret-like parts of their genomes become. The line runs both ways. The domestic ferret came from the polecat, and in some landscapes the polecat has been altered, in return, by the ferret. So the history is not a straight line from wild to tame. It is a loop. A wild European predator becomes a domestic specialist. The domestic specialist travels with humans, survives by human design, narrows genetically, changes behaviorally, becomes pet, worker, laboratory animal. Then, through escape, release, or feral persistence, fragments of that domestic history leak back into the wild ancestor's genome. That is not the story we were taught. We prefer origins to be clean, almost ceremonial. We like wolves becoming dogs, aurochs becoming cattle, jungle cats becoming house cats. We like a beginning that can be pointed to. Ferrets resist that impulse. Their history is evasive. They emerge through textual confusion, practical use, uncertain geography, and genetic afterimages. Maybe that is why they feel so modern, despite being ancient companions. They do not symbolize settled domestication. They symbolize process. Entanglement. The way human needs can reshape an animal without ever fully erasing the wild design beneath it. Look at a ferret and you still see the old engineering intact, the flexible spine, the predator's mouth, the body built to enter places we cannot. Domestication did not invent that shape. It recruited it. And that gives the animal a different kind of dignity. The ferret is not a trivial pet descended from some forgotten curiosity. It is the surviving instrument of a long negotiation between landscape, prey, and human problem-solving. Between rabbit plagues and underground pursuit. Between European polecats and Mediterranean economies. Between the archive's uncertainty and the genome's reluctant clarity. So we return to the drawer, the skull, the faded tag. Under that museum light, Libya no longer reads like a final answer. It reads like a clue from an earlier stage of understanding, a label attached to movement rather than beginning. The true origin lies deeper than the tag allowed, closer to the European polecat, closer to a scattered domestication history, closer to a relationship so practical and gradual that history almost failed to notice it while it was happening. Sometimes the past does not hide because the evidence is gone. Sometimes it hides because the story we inherited was too polished to ask the right questions. And if this kind of investigation is worth following, you can stay with me for the next one. For now, it is enough to know that in the narrow skull of a ferret, and in the dark tunnels it was shaped to enter, an older and stranger history still survives.